Okay, now we're going to start looking at objectives 14 and a little bit, objective 15 and a little bit of 16. But mainly we're going to focus on the thyroid gland in this video. Anatomically, the thyroid gland secretes thyroid hormone and calcitonin. It's found in your anterior neck. It's superficial to your larynx. It's shaped like a butterfly, and it's got a right lobe and a left lobe, and they're connected by this band of thyroid tissue that we call an isthmus, and it's a very vascular organ. You can see it here, and here right in the center is your isthmus. Very awkward word. Now, microscopically, you've got little spheres, little thyroid follicles. And the follicle cells at the outer edge of that follicle, that's what produces and secretes the thyroid hormones. There's a rich protein gelatinous material called colloid inside the follicle. It has a precursor to the thyroid hormone. It also has a high concentration of iodine. And you've got to have both of these in order to make the thyroid hormones. You've got to have the iodine, so you always need to eat and use iodized salt. The parafollicular cells are between the thyroid follicles, and they're pretty large cells, and they make the hormone calcitonin. And you can see here what I'm talking about. That's the parafollicular cells there, and then you see the follicles here with the follicle cells around the edge, and the colloid is in the center, that protein-rich gelatin stuff. Now, the parathyroid glands are on the back side of the thyroid gland. You usually have 3 to 5 of them. And they secrete parathyroid hormone from their chief cells, and we'll talk about that in the next video. Now, going back to the thyroid hormone consists of an amino acid core, and it's either going to be bound to 3 or 4 iodine atoms. 3 would make T3, 4 would make T4. Both of those are active physiologically, but T3 is more active, and a lot of times T4 is converted into T3. And they're both amino acids. They're more hydrophobic than other amino acid hormones, so they don't interact at all with the plasma membrane receptors. They go all the way to the nucleus and bind with receptors there, and they will activate or inhibit gene transcription there. What are the effects? Almost every cell in your body has hormone receptors, thyroid hormone receptors, so it has very widespread effects. There's 3 categories of effects. First is the regulation of metabolic rate and thermoregulation. They set your BMR, your basal metabolic rate, how much energy your body uses just to stay alive. They can increase your ATP consumption, and they do this 3 ways: by increasing the synthesis of ATP. That's going to require more sodium and potassium pumps. Gluconeogenesis happens. Gluco is sugar, neo is new, genesis is to make. So making new sugar and breaking down proteins in your muscles and your fats. Also, they react how some tissues, in some tissues, build proteins and fats. The second way affects regulation of metabolic rate and thermoregulation. I'm sorry, not a second way, the same way, not paying attention. They can increase the rate of both catabolic and anabolic reactions without changing the cell's overall consumption, keeping it equally. Well, why would cells want to expend energy and really have no change in the amount of thyroid hormone? Because it makes it, we lose a lot of energy in heat. Heat helps maintain our core temperature, though, so it's important. So that's why that has to happen. The second way now is to promote growth and development. We got to have thyroid hormones for bone growth, muscle growth, and development of our nervous system. The third way is synergism with the sympathetic nervous system, because it can increase the receptors for the sympathetic neurotransmitters, upregulation, and that will affect blood pressure, heart rate, and other activities of the sympathetic nervous system. We regulate the production of T3 and T4 with negative feedback loops, and there's 3 tiers of control. The hypothalamus will secrete thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH. That will cause the anterior pituitary to release TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, and that will cause the production of T3 and T4 by follicle cells in the thyroid gland. And so we secrete the T3 and T4 into the blood, and it affects the growth and development of the thyroid gland. The third tier would be the production and secretion of thyroid releasing hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone. That will increase when the levels of free T3 and T4 fall, or your body is exposed to very cold temperatures. The third tier also happens when you have the secretion of the TRH and the TSH inhibited, because you've got rising levels of T3 and T4. And the TSH can also be inhibited by the hormone somatostatin.
Welcome back. You've just been introduced to multi-tiered feedback loops. Now, these obviously look different from the feedback loops that you're used to seeing. These multi-tiered feedback loops can make it difficult to see the negative feedback that's occurring at all of the different levels of control. This is especially true for conditions like hyper and hypothyroidism. So let's take a closer look at this and see if we can give your understanding a boost.
Up until this chapter, you've seen a fairly standard negative feedback loop, like the generic one we've shown here. Some regulated variable changes from its normal range, a receptor detects it, and a control center triggers an effector to return the variable to its normal range. It's all fairly simple. You normally see this loop in a circle, but we've put this one in a line to make it easier to compare to the loops we are about to discuss. With the endocrine system, we have introduced multi-tiered feedback loops that look like this. Such loops are involved in regulating the secretion of several hormones, including thyroid hormone. Remember that hormones from the hypothalamus control secretions from the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary then releases hormones which control the functions of other glands, such as the thyroid. These glands then release their hormones, and these hormones have effects on the body. The amount of hormone released and the effects they produce will then lead to negative feedback that then affects the hypothalamus and/or the anterior pituitary.
As you've seen, hypothalamic neurons secrete TRH, thyrotropin-releasing hormone, into blood vessels in response to a variety of stimuli, including low levels of thyroid hormone in the blood.
TRH, then stimulates the release of TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, from the anterior pituitary. TSH then travels through the blood and stimulates the production and release of thyroid hormones, which we're showing here, in addition to the growth and development of the thyroid gland itself. All of this increases the levels of the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, in the blood. Now, if we turn to our multi-tiered feedback loop, we can see that normal thyroid function results in an increase in T3 and T4. The high levels of T3 and T4 are detected by receptors in the hypothalamus. The negative feedback from these receptors then communicates to the hypothalamus that the job of stimulating the thyroid gland is done, so secretion of TRH falls, and so does secretion of TSH. But what happens if the thyroid gland isn't functioning properly? Let's look first at what happens to our feedback loop in hypothyroidism, or when the thyroid is unable to produce enough thyroid hormones. Our loop starts off the same. Low T3 and T4 trigger TRH secretion. TRH stimulates TSH release, and TSH stimulates T3 and T4 release. The difference now is that T3 and T4 levels don't rise because the thyroid is not functioning properly. This means the endpoint is never reached and the loop essentially starts over again. So the TRH and TSH levels continue to increase, but the T3 and T4 levels remain low. This leads to the characteristic findings with hypothyroidism: high TSH and low T3 and T4. Now, if we turn to hyperthyroidism, it shouldn't be surprising that we see the reverse. Here notice that the thyroid is overproducing T3 and T4. This simply stimulates the receptors that communicate to the hypothalamus to decrease TRH production, which in turn decreases TSH production, in effect shutting down the whole loop. However, because the thyroid does not respond to the control, it keeps overproducing T3 and T4. This leads to the characteristic findings with hyperthyroidism: low TSH and high T3 and T4.
So you can see from this that thyroid disorders are caused because you can overproduce hyperthyroidism, or you can underproduce hypothyroidism, the thyroid hormones. Hyperthyroidisms you're going to have, or thyroidism, you're going to have weight loss, heat intolerance, your blood pressure, your heart rhythms are going to be disruptive and not normal, and you could develop a goiter or the exophthalmos, where the thyroid gland enlarges, you get this big knot on your neck, and your eyeballs seem to be out of their sockets. They bulge. Graves' disease is also common, where you've got some immune system things that are being produced that mimic the actions of the TSH. So you're going to make too much of the T3 and T4. Now with hypothyroidism, you're going to have weight gain, cold intolerance, a slow heart rate, low blood pressure, possibly a goiter, and it could be caused either from your immune system disorder or from not getting enough iodine. With congenital hypothyroidism, the infant's born with inadequate thyroid function, and it can cause delayed physical and nervous system development and maybe even mental retardation. And you can see there what a goiter can look like. Now, to understand these feedback loops, if your T3 and T4 levels in your blood drop, the receptors in the cells of the hypothalamus detect the change, so it secretes more thyroid-releasing hormone, TRH, and that causes the anterior pituitary to secrete more TSH. Normally, those elevated TSH levels will cause the thyroid gland to make more T3 and T4. And as the T3 and T4 levels rise, the receptors in the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland detect it, and so those levels of TRH and TSH are going to decrease. But when you have hypothyroidism, the thyroid gland can't make more T3 and T4. So your hypothalamus and your anterior pituitary don't get the message that the thyroid gland's not working. The receptors see that your T3 and T4 levels are low, so the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary secrete more TRH and TSH to stimulate the thyroid. And then it works in reverse for hyperthyroidism. The cells of the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland normally decrease production of TRH and TSH if you have a rise in T3 and T4 levels. But when you have hyperthyroidism, you've got more T3 and T4, so the receptors in the hypothalamus detect this, and you're going to produce more TRH and TSH. And so those levels are going to get low.